Where did Adolf Hitler and the leading Nazi officials go wrong? Well, in today's episode of Everything History, we will bring you the answers. This video will be quite broad and will cover all economic, political, and military mistakes or blunders within the timeline of World War II. Without further ado, let's begin. Mistake number 1. Starting the war in 1939. The long-term effects of beginning World War II in September of 1939 is definitely a major talking point amongst historians. During the 1930s, Germany was rapidly growing stronger every single day, recovering and then surpassing the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. Post-World War I, and the Germans were restricted to only 100,000 men in the army. No submarines, no airplanes, and only 6 battleships. Fast forward to 1939, the numbers rose to 2.7 million soldiers, 4,000 aircraft and 2 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 3 armored cruisers, 3 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 22 destroyers, and 59 submarines. Amongst this, the manipulative Nazi propaganda was definitely gaining more and more support and devotion to Germany via the public. If they had waited longer, considering their current pace of progression, their numbers and technology would have been far better than what it was already. One popular counter-argument to this point is that the longer they waited, the less of a surprise they could put on the Allies. Even though Britain and France were definitely slow to pull the trigger, every German misstep was being noted, such as the disregard to the military restrictions and the occupation of Czechoslovakia. The most popular counter-argument using hindsight is the race for atomic bombs, which, as we know, the Americans were definitely a few feet ahead. Mistake number 2. Battle of Britain. The second mistake came after the invasion of France when the Germans had only 2 options, the first being to invade Britain and the latter to befriend them. Despite English support for Germany during the early 1930s, and perceived similarities amongst the Germans and English made by Adolf Hitler, it was clear that the British public would not fold and would continue fighting the Axis by themselves out of pure defiance. Add Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, and it should have been obvious a peace treaty was extremely unlikely. Attempts were made to try to cross the English Channel, albeit thwarted by the RAF, Royal Navy, and Mother Nature that prevented any land invasions. Bearing in mind Operation Barbarossa wouldn't be put in place until a year later, and more importantly didn't even need to happen. Failure to invade Britain was a massive disappointment. With the British Empire still in the war, Hitler now had to continue to deal with the Royal Navy, British campaigns in North Africa, British colonies across multiple theaters, a massive influence directly to the United States, and most importantly the potential for an Allied invasion via the English Channel. The defeat in the Battle of Britain wasn't even a direct mistake made by Hitler. It was just an extremely hard task to pull off. But because of the severity of the task, it had to make the list. Mistake number 3. Stalingrad blunder. Arguably the most famous moment in the entirety of the Second World War came in 1941, when Operation Barbarossa failed, just 10 miles short of Moscow, thus creating the prolonged Battle of Stalingrad. After being halted at Moscow, Hitler decided to send a large force south to the Caucasus oil fields. Then followed the most terrible battle in the history of war. Deprived of their blitzkrieg tactics, the Germans were forced to fight in the ruined city where the Russians were better adapted to the conditions. The fighting was terrible and the casualties horrendous. Although the Germans took 90% of the city, they were caught unaware by Operation Uranus, which trapped their forces in a Kessel. Faced with ice-cold weather and starvation, the Wehrmacht for the first time in the war had met its peak. Again, the persistence and ego of Adolf Hitler cost Germany. The conditions and terrain of the Western Front was vastly different to that of the East, and the military methodology adopted by Hitler was not suited to the conflict to say the least. Unlike Napoleon, who attempted the same over a century ago, Germany was able to at least maintain the front, but it simply was not enough. This moment was definitely the beginning of the end for the Nazis, but it wasn't completely hopeless. Mistake number 4. Technological advancements during the 1930s and 1940s. The race for the first atomic bombs was crucial to modern conflicts and the future beyond the Second World War. On one side, you had the Allies and the Manhattan Project, which mainly comprised American, British, and Canadian research. And on the other, you had Nazi Germany. Still, to this day, it is very unknown what was the fault or lack of information the Nazis had compared to the Allies. Some sources point to inefficient or little use of uranium, but the common thought is that the Germans were just a few steps behind, having only completed preliminary research 1 year after the United States had already begun testing in 1943. Mistake number 5. Declaring war on the USA. It should be common knowledge that the arrival of the Americans in 1941 heavily shifted the tides of the war in both the Pacific and European theaters in the Allies' favor. But what if I told you that Hitler declaring war on the United States was completely avoidable? See, after the attack on Pearl Harbor on behalf of the Japanese, the Americans swiftly declared war exclusively on Japan, not Germany. Obviously, the USA was aiding Britain and the Allies in the fight against the Axis by supplying equipment and goods, just as they did in the First World War. And whilst it remains likely the US would have eventually gone to war with Hitler, it certainly wouldn't have happened as quickly, considering the Nazi support in the country at the time. This was another case of Hitler's arrogance and ego getting the better of him, just as it did many times during his time as Führer of the Third German Reich. Now that I have listed all 5, I'd personally say that the blunder in Russia is definitely the biggest mistake made by the Germans, with the Battle of Britain being the most pivotal. Thank you for watching this Everything History video. What did you think was the biggest mistake Hitler and the Nazis made in the Second World War? Let us know in the comments below.